nice chilly morning, right? Seems like we'll have a few more of those ahead of us. This morning we're going to be in Nehemiah chapter 2. And before we start this morning, I've asked Gary if he wouldn't mind to lead our minds in prayer. Amen. So everybody's got their skis and sleds waxed and ready to go, right? We'll see what events hold in store for us tonight and tomorrow. There's no telling. On Wednesday night, we started our study in Nehemiah, continuing on from where we were in Ezra. And we'll see Ezra makes an appearance here again as we get into the latter chapters of Nehemiah. But we saw in Nehemiah chapter 1, it started off where his brother Hananiah came back from Jerusalem and he asked how things were going there. And he was quite distraught when he heard the description that was given to him, that the remnant there that had survived exile was in great trouble and shame, that the wall of Jerusalem had been broken down, its gates destroyed by fire. And we had estimated that, this was somewhere in the neighborhood of 90 to 100 years or so since Cyrus first had made his proclamation to let the Jews return from exile. And we saw Nehemiah's response, right? That he sat down, he wept, he mourned, he fasted, and he prayed before the God of heaven. So one of the key things that I think we took away, hopefully, from the first chapter of Nehemiah was that we saw right off from the introduction of him in terms of a character profile, right? We saw the introduction of him as an individual that depends heavily upon God. And we'll see that continues in the story of him and the events that surround his life as we get into chapter 2. We saw how prayer was a foundation of who Nehemiah is. And that becomes evident again today as we study chapter 2 in a different perspective. But I think they tie strongly together. We might have some conversations about that. We talked about themes a little bit on Wednesday night, and that prayer is something that's consistent throughout. The idea of being rebuilt and renewed is a thematic scheme that we will see throughout Nehemiah, and how we even ourselves are rebuilt and renewed. And then we also commented on how there's elements of leadership in the very way that Nehemiah conducted himself. And hopefully today, I think we'll see in chapter 2, we'll kind of focus upon a couple of those principles and kind of draw out in that regards. And then one item that we didn't discuss, but I want to bring it up now, and I'll come back to it at the end of class, because I want you to be thinking about it. Maybe you have, as you've already begun your readings and your study of Nehemiah, is to look for ways that we see Nehemiah is a foreshadowing of Jesus, and that there's similarities between what we see happening in the life of Nehemiah and what we see happening in the life of Jesus. I think we'll see several of those today in chapter 2. Leadership, how he inspires and encourages others to work together. So as we look in chapter 2, so chapter 1 concluded, right, that it was the month of Chislev, and he had heard those news day and night. He had continued in prayer, and we saw in chapter 2 we begin. It's the month of Nisan, so about a period of 4 months between those. So we'll see as you kind of break down the outline of chapter 2, right? So verses 1 through 8, there's this conversation that takes place between Nehemiah and the king, King Artaxerxes. Hopefully we'll look at some lessons here in regards to prayer, to communication, anything else that you might have identified. Verses 9 and 10, we see Nehemiah's arrival from Mesopotamia over into Jerusalem. Verses 11 and 16, we see where he kind of goes with a close circle of friends and at night surveys and inspects the walls. Verses 17 and 18, that's kind of like the big reveal, right? I'm letting everybody know what God has put into my heart to do. And then verses 19 to 20, we see opposition immediately rising. And then we also, in that same vein, see from Nehemiah a strong expression of confidence and who that confidence is in. So let's read the first. I'll read the first 8 verses of Nehemiah chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad, seeing you're not sick? This is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. So as we read this story, what jumps out to you in terms of Nehemiah, his approach to the situation that he was faced with? How he said things, maybe even, how the relationship was between, I'm just seeking for your thoughts and opinions as to what jumps out of you in these first 8 verses of scale.
I think I see it here, your eyes, you so many times, going back to the first chapter, I asked, what were the rumors like? And then I asked the king, in other words, to me, this Nehemiah is showing the realm of leadership. He's not afraid of what's going to happen to me. He's not saying that's somebody else's problem. That's my problem. And I'm going to have it with God's help. And so that's exactly what I see. I see it over and over and over. I went to the king. It takes a lot of leadership to step out, because only the people who step out that would kill a rock on them. People who sit there and hold their head down and never get a rock.
Yeah.
He was ready for a rock.
Now, that's a great point. We do see the utilization of I. He's taking ownership a lot for what he feels. He wants to be a part of the solution, right? So it's very easy to identify a solution and point that out and with the expectation, okay, well, everybody else is going to go fix that and get it done, right? And 99 times out of 100, that never happens. But here, to your point, as we'll see, you see Nehemiah, he himself personally has a vested interest in this, and he takes the initiative, and he takes the ownership for it, and he wants to be a part of the solution. Great comment. What else, Jack?
Well, just piggyback on that, he's putting himself at great risk here with the king. I mean, the guy that's checking the king's wine before him shows up and he's not in a good mood. Not a good thing for the king.
Yeah, it does. You catch that, right? It's like there's a couple of elements I find interesting about that. It actually speaks to the relationship that they do have, right? So there's a very close relationship between these two individuals, because he notices something's different about him. And you're not going to notice that unless you really know somebody, right? I mean, to where you can be able to address and say, I've noticed something different about this. And the king brings up his pointed question, why is your face sad? I know you're not sick, right? So it's a sadness to the heart. So the king brings that to his point, and we learn a lot from regards to in the study of Esther, right? What the kind of laws were in regards to approaching the king, knowing that the king, if it was his desire, you could be put to death. He might, you don't know what Nehemiah is fearing at this point in time. Good point, Jack. What else?
Roger, he says at the end of verse 8 something that we saw Ezra speak to as well. He said, and the king granted me, for the good hand of my God was upon me, the hand of God being upon him. We talked about that a lot in Ezra as well. So there's this continual, faith that they're demonstrating that we saw in Ezra and that we're seeing in Nehemiah as well, about the hand of God being a part of this.
Yes. You see that evident in their prayers, the utilization of terminology like this. We'll see it as to, this whole endeavor here is not something that is being done for Nehemiah's benefit. He's not doing it for his sake. He's doing it for the glory of God and his name and where it should be established in Jerusalem.
He had enough detailed information to make a detailed plan to present to the king.
That's a great comment. He had put a lot of thought and foresight into this, right? Because the king kind of just off the cuff asked him very pointedly, well, what are you requesting? And Nehemiah had enough knowledge and information and thought into what he wanted to achieve that, a couple of things came out. He was to give him, number one, a specific time. I'm going to go and do this and come back. And then secondarily, he also had, I'm going to need this type of supplies. I'm going to need this to rebuild the gates surrounding the temple, the walls, the buildings. I'm going to need wood for my own house where I'm going to live there. He had put a lot of thought. So this 4 months between these period of times to where he first heard this news and where now he took this opportunity to make this poignant request, it had weighed heavily on him, and he had spent a lot of time in thought in regards to that. Great comment. What else? Yeah, Anish.
2 comments. First, that we know the kind of timing of this because it's the 20th year of Xerxes, so whoever kind of looks at their timeline, temporal kind of basis.
Yep.
Verse 4. Yeah, verse 4 is interesting because he says it's kind of micro prayer, a praying to God.
Yeah.
So that might be one of the shortest prayers for the response to the king.
Yeah. I want to dive a little deeper into that. I think there's some things that we can potentially pull out of that. So setting that aside for just a second, any other thoughts or comments? Wes?
It seems
I believe he does. He does. He goes back, and then he's appointed to governor when he goes back to Jerusalem. So I think he does fulfill his obligation here that he would return at a point. Yeah. I think we see that in chapter 12 and 13, if I remember correctly. Someone please check me on that. So don't trust me. Trust but verify. Trust but verify everything I say. What else? Great comments. Let me recap a couple of things. Just going through my notes here. Some of these we'd already kind of addressed here, right? So, number one, I noticed that we see Nehemiah throughout this is extremely respectful. There's a great level of respect that he shows towards King Artaxerxes and his position that he's in, right? He begins by his very opening words, "Let the king live forever." And that just wasn't some sort of nicety that he was throwing out to kind of earn good favor, because you get down to verse 5, he says, "If it pleases the king," right? So he's interesting. I think Tyler kind of briefly, he's not here today. Tyler alluded to that a little bit on Wednesday night, where it was interesting. He approaches him, and it's like he's driving his thoughts and his request home, not being demanding or self-centered, but I'm thinking of you. We talked about there's a closeness that seems to exist between Nehemiah and the king, the sense of fear as well because of who he is. And the other interesting element was we found that he was, very clear and concise when he spoke before Artaxerxes. He didn't deviate off into any rabbit holes or long trails of thought, yet he was able to very concisely convey something that was very emotional and socially important to him. He made the most of the opportunity of where he was, right? He had a right to be where he was. He was the cupbearer to the king. There was wine being served. So it was the situation where he should find himself. But he made the most of an opportunity that was presented to him. It's interesting. I thought that he addresses himself as your servant. He had used the very similar language in his prayer back in the first chapter, right, where he uses the term your servant as well. So not only I want to do this if you want me to do, Father, back in chapter 1, and now again to the king, I'm your servant. Verse 6, we saw he had, clear expectations about the time that it's going to take, a lot of thought and insight and everything. And then to Anisha's comment. So in verse 4, we have this little interlude that, why are you sad? And he's like, why shouldn't I be sad? The city, without being specific, the place of my father's life. And the king said, well, what are you requesting? So I prayed to the God of heaven. What do you think he prayed for? And this is just purely, right, conjecture on our parts. We have no insight whatsoever, or nothing to where we read what he might have said. But if you were in that situation, what do you think he would have prayed for? Or would you? Guidance on what to ask for? Okay. Let me remember my plan. Yeah. Maybe the counterpoint to, like, instead of what to ask for, give me strength or guidance to say what I have planned and have thought through. Yeah.
It'd be also that your will be done, and of course, don't let my big ideas get in the way of what you want to happen.
I think that's a great point, Gail. Yeah. We see that throughout Nehemiah, his focus upon God and God's glory and God's will being done. And his recognition that this is that critical moment where I've got that opportunity. May what I do next glorify you. What else? I had just kind of jotted down certain things like that. give me strength, get me through this. But as we note, it's super short. It's immediate. It's very quick. Didn't go off into a closet by himself. But I think what one takeaway from this in this perspective is that the best short prayers are effective when you have a long prayer relationship with God. Not to use that as an example, but we saw that in the first chapter, from the whole second half. And that's something that he continued to do night and day, it says. So you're not going to have the confidence to really go into that short prayer and thy will be done if you haven't spent a substantial amount of time in to use the terminology, a long prayer situation, right? And developing that relationship. Yes, Dan.
I think this is a really good point that you bring out, and I'm glad you brought it up, because this is just an example in Holy Scripture of a great man of God. It's something that we very often fail to do as people of God. I see lots of Christians jump into their food, and they don't pray, they don't say thank you to the Lord for providing the food that they have. And what that signifies is a forgetting of God, forgetting where your blessings come from, because every single thing we have comes from Him. And when we neglect to say thank you, it's a simple thank you. It doesn't take but a few seconds.
Yeah.
But we're required to do it. It's a command of us. And when we overlook little things like that, how many big things does that lead to us overlooking in our Christian walk?
Okay. Great comment. Thank you. So moving on, we'll continue here in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10. It says, I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen, but when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So if you remember in our study of Ezra, and this is just kind of assuming he followed a similar track and pattern and timeline, how long did we see that it took Ezra to travel from where he was to Jerusalem? I remember. It's 4 months. I'm seeing a lot of fourth quarter symbols. So 4 months, right? Yeah. Took them 4 months. It was like 800, 900 miles, I think, if we kind of estimated that. But his arrival is a little different than Ezra's, right? Do you notice what's different about Nehemiah's arrival than when Ezra came? He's got some soldiers with him. Yeah, Ezra did not travel with soldiers. He didn't have any officers of the army. He didn't have any horsemen. Anish, you're gonna say?
Oh yeah, I think Eric brought that point up earlier. Because Ezra prays, for God's blessing, which talks about not having soldiers, right? Not that kind of army.
Yeah. Yep. And it's interesting here we see, right, even before anything is happening, already there is opposition brewing in the hearts of some individuals, right? They were greatly displeased to see someone who had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel.
I just feel like going against the people, the children of Israel, I feel like it was a constant thing for them. I don't think it's like there was ups and downs. I feel like that they constantly dealt with, pushback as it related to
great comment, great comment. Even when he did have letters of authority, right? I mean, even from the perspective that, I mean, which was very important in terms of the Babylonian and the Persian, legacies, right? We saw that back in Ezra. Well, go find out what was written back before.
But it's kind of like what's happening on the ground doesn't always align with what, the officials are saying that you have approval to do.
Right,
It's
right,
kinda-
right.
It's kind of the ground situation that
Right.
we have to deal with.
Okay, so verses 11 through 16 says here, I went to Jerusalem and I was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I expected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered by the valley gate and so returned. The officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing. I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. So we see here Nehemiah has been in Jerusalem for 3 days, and he arises at night. He takes just one animal with him, which is an interesting comment or an interesting fact that's pointed out, and I think that maybe helps understand why he's not seeking to draw any attention to him. He doesn't go alone. He's got a close circle of friends, individuals that he brings with him. So why does he do this? Why do you think he surveys the walls, privately? Why do you think it's important to Nehemiah that he go do this, as he says, before he had told anyone what God had put into his heart?
Because if you take too many people with you, all those people might not have the same mindset that you have. And if it's a very strong personality that has a disciplined mindset, it can be very discouraging. Your courage might kind of lose a little bit when people who are well known in the group say, I don't think that's going to work. I don't think I can do that.
Right. It makes you wonder, like, he takes a close circle of friends who actually knew what his character was, the type of individual he was, so that would likely prevent anything from like that happening if you took a larger group that might have differing opinions. Yeah.
I think it could happen that way in the congregation of the church.
Yes.
That maybe all of the things should be heard before you come to a conclusion of what you want to do, because there are people who have very strong opinions and can kind of sway the whole crowd more than another person can.
Yes. What else? What other thoughts? That's a good thoughts, Gail.
He has firsthand knowledge, so he knows that he's talking to people, like Gail said. Are you telling me the truth, or are you shading this in some form?
Yeah. So he'd gotten a reliable report from Hananiah, his brother, but he wants to see it first. He wants to see it for himself before he shares anything. And it can validate the plans that he'd kind of had in place. It can also help if there's opposition arise and says, you know what, there's no way we can do that over there, by the valley gate. It's just too, he's like, no, I've seen that with my own eyes. I know this is what can be done. Great point. Conrad, I think you had a comment?
In verse 12, there's a phrase that a lot of believers today will use, that God put something in their heart, or God put it on my heart to do something. And he uses that same phrasing here, that God put in his heart to do something at Jerusalem. What do you think he's saying there? What does he mean by that?
That's a great question. Thoughts?
Yeah, Roger, I'll take a stab at that.
Take a stab at it, Dan.
I'll comment on that.
Okay.
Nice timing, Conrad.
Yes.
Okay, chapter 2, every few verses you see something like, the good hand of my God was upon me. And he just keeps coming back to God. And I believe this is a valuable lesson for us, because we can be inspired by God to do good and great and spiritual things without him directly speaking to us to do them.
Yeah.
And now I don't know if that's the case here. God may have responded to him in some way. I don't know. But we definitely see a man here who is dedicated to the service of the Lord. He prays at every turn. Clearly God is the most important center of his life. And he's just confident that God is with him.
Yeah.
And what a valuable example for us.
Yeah. I was going to go back to the prayer as well in the first chapter, and we see that this is something that was on his mind for a period of time. And if you recall, we looked at the phraseology that he uses in that prayer is he's referencing back to the law, to Deuteronomy, to God's promises that you will return us to that, and to the city to where your name will dwell. And so I think through that's my impersonation or impression of what God put upon his heart, is that his mind was very focused and thoughtful upon that. And we'll look here, we'll see later, we talk about the reason he gives the people, right, to do this. We'll see that. It's because it's a reproach on and we'll look at that. So that's my thoughts and opinion. And he has spent an enormous amount of time reflecting upon God's word and his promises to Israel and to the remnant and who they were.
Can I just ask one question? I'd love the class to, or you, anybody, to respond if they'd like to. Again, this question of God put it on my heart, and we do hear that, especially in the evangelical community. But I personally don't see anything wrong with that, because I interpret that as Nehemiah saying, God inspired me to do this. And I personally don't see anything wrong with us saying, you know what, I've been inspired to start teaching. God put it on my heart to start teaching. If we're in the book, if we're studying on a constant basis, wouldn't it stand to reason that God would put things in your heart to do good things?
John?
If you're familiar with the Word of God, you'll know when you come on a situation where there's need, where encouragement is warranted, that God would have you do that, verified by His Word. You know what I'm saying? For example, there's a command that we visit widows and orphans in their affliction. Well, you come on a widow who has need, and you have funds that you can help her. And have you ever heard someone say, well, I purposed in my heart to do such and such? Well, for me, that's the same thing. Because of God, because of His Word, because of His desire, I purposed in my heart. Because God gave me that desire and purpose in my heart to do something good. That may or may not make any sense.
No, it does. I think it's a great comment. You have the spirit to act, and therefore when the opportunity to do something presents itself, it's second nature that you act, right? You've already developed that spirit in your heart, and this is like Isaiah's "Here am I, send me" moment, right? This is Nehemiah's "Here am I, send me" moment. That's his mindset, and we in verses, we'll get to it a little bit. He also kind of talks about in verse 18, how the hand of God had been good to me for good. So he definitely realizes his reliance upon the Lord for all things. A couple of comments that I had noticed in here in these passages, right? So there's that sense of personal responsibility. He had made a commitment to the king, so that's kind of one of his reasons for doing this, and he wanted to visualize with his own eyes to know how big of a project. And when you think about from a leadership perspective, right? If you were trying to get applications from that, great leaders do their homework, right? They don't go ask everybody to jump on board until they know exactly what kind of ship they're building. They've got a vision for what it looks like. They inspire confidence when they have actually spent the time looking at everything. The last thing you experience is like in a Q&A session, if something's unfamiliar with a perspective and don't know the answer to everything, then you kind of lose a little bit of confidence in that individual and what they may have. So great leaders kind of, they prepare for opposition, they prepare for objections, obstacles as well, and hindrances. So verses 17 and 18, let's look at this really, really quickly, because I think it ties into the idea of what my God had put into my heart. He says in verse 17, "Then I said to them, you see the trouble we're in now, how Jerusalem lies in ruin, with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision. And I told of them the hand of my God that had been put upon me for good, and also the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, let us rise up and build. So they strengthened their hands for the good work." So here, verse 16, we saw he hadn't told the Jews, the priests, nobles, he hadn't made known to anyone what was in his heart yet. And then now verse 17, we've got the big reveal, right? And notice how Nehemiah kind of seems to lay this out. So what's the problem? Beginning of verse 17. What's the problem? Sorry, do what? The ruins, yeah. He says, you see the trouble we're in, right? Jerusalem lies in ruins. Its gates are burned. I mean, he's pointing out the obvious to a lot of these people that have been there, but sometimes you've got to state the obvious, right? They've been living with this problem, but it's what I came here to address. So that's the problem. What's the solution? Yes.
I'm a curious person by nature,
Yeah.
so I did a little bit of research on the wall. Well, we don't know how much the wall is broken down. You only have to break down one section of it to get through. But the wall, I believe, was approximately 4 foot high and 8 foot thick, and the circumference of it measures 2.5 miles. Well, that's a lot of stone, that's a lot of wall.
Yeah.
Well, by going up and inspecting it like he did, he would have found out how much of the wall was actually broken down.
Right.
And you think about the gates being destroyed by fire, what was there, 9 sets of gates that went into the city? And so it would be easy to take 3 or 4 carts of firewood to each one of them, and pile up again on the outside and set it on fire and burn those down. It would have been to knock a lot of wall down.
Yeah.
So, going and looking for yourself sometimes is something that's necessary.
Yeah.
And obviously, maybe there was one stretch of wall broken down, maybe there was a mile of it broken down, who knows?
Yeah, it solidified his, yeah,
God had a big part in what to back up.
solidified his plans on what to do. Yeah, he says, let us build the wall of Jerusalem. Why? And so why build the walls? Why build the walls? That we may no longer suffer derision. Some verses say we may no longer be a reproach. If you remember, we looked in Deuteronomy 12, verses 8 through 11. Jerusalem was where my name may dwell. God's name would dwell there. The reason to act here is not for personal safety. It's not for security. Walls provide those. But you know what? God's their protector. God is their security. God is their provider. He's addressing the real why here. He's saying, why? Because we're a reproach. That's not the way things are supposed to be. Israel is supposed to be a light to the nations, and we're not at this point. It's very interesting to me that is the application that he's making here. And why build it now? Because God's blessed them. The hand of God has been upon me. God has blessed me. And the king has spoken these things. But it's not that the king has spoken these things and God's blessed me. I don't know if there's importance to the order. I think there is. God has blessed me. And in doing so also, the king has provided resources, people, everything. But it shows that throughout this process, since he first heard the news, since he was before the king, traveling, he has gone every step of the way relying upon God. And we see in the last part that, he starts to face opposition here from Sanballat, Tobiah, and another individual, Geshem the Arab. Like, what are you doing? Why are you rebelling? And Nehemiah defends his plan, right? He says, the God of heaven will make us prosper. This is what he's prayed about for 4 months. This is what he's traveled to do for 4 months. God has been with him every step of the way. He's provided the path for him to go, and he has total faith that God is the one that is going to deliver this project. So I'm not going to succumb to your scare tactics. Go tell the king. That doesn't that doesn't faze me, or whatever may be their thoughts. So we see in these 2 chapters, these first 2 chapters of Nehemiah, we see him presented with the news of Jerusalem. He begins with prayer. His prayer leads him to act. And then he looks to God's good hand to give him success. So start with prayer, continue with prayer, and recognize that God's the giver. Now, very quickly, I mentioned this at the beginning, and before I lose time. We'll see this throughout Nehemiah, but I think we see a picture of our Savior Jesus. And when you look at Nehemiah, he foreshadows the work of Jesus in the world. Nehemiah 2 and verse 5, we see Nehemiah does what? He leaves his place at the throne. What does Jesus do? He leaves his place at the throne. In verse 17 of chapter 2, we see where he comes to address a crisis and a plan to restore and rebuild. What does Jesus do? He comes to seek and save those who are lost, to build us back up into what we should be. And then lastly, at the end of chapter 2, you see where he's mocked by rulers. What was Jesus done? He was mocked by rulers. I think we'll see more of this. Keep that thought bubbling in your mind as we continue through Nehemiah. You may see other opportunities of that in our study. So thank you so much for your time and for your comments this morning.